Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to Wednesday. I see most of us have survived the worst of the heat. Oh, man, I couldn't believe it when I opened the bedroom door and walked out into the hallway and it was like a normal temperature. Oh, unbelievable. It's so hot though, right? Jeez. Yeah, I think we were talking about that yesterday, but that is very abnormal for here. So we, God willing, it will never get that hot ever again. Yeah, yeah, that was intense. Okay, so Basil's here. Good morning, Basil. Simran is here. Good morning, Simran. Hassan is here. Good morning, Hassan. Kang is here. Good morning, Kang. And Reza's here. Good morning, Reza. Okie dokie. Let's deal with this really quickly here. Yesterday we were just summarizing. We were summarizing sexism, right? Because we were done, right? We were just wrapping it up, right? And so I said, one of the things we're looking for in social justice is to create equal opportunities and make resources sort of equally accessible to everyone, right? So we don't want to sort of give everyone the same thing. Everyone doesn't need the same thing. And actually, I was thinking a good example of this, and I don't have the article handy, but if you go to Ottawa, you can go to the Parliament building. So you can go to our main governmental um, building where Justin Trudeau and all the MPs sit and argue all day long and don't do anything. No, I'm just kidding. But you can go and visit the Parliament buildings. And on Parliament Hill, I think a couple years ago, they built a new set of outdoor washrooms, right? So there's lots of people walking around. It's beautiful. It's downtown Ottawa. And so they built these public washrooms. But interestingly, they built them so that half of that space was for men and half of it was for women, which one would think makes sense, right? But some people spoke up and said, actually, that's not fair, because they argued that, first of all, women have more reasons to use the bathroom than men do. Often when they do use the bathroom, they're in there longer. Often their clothing is kind of more difficult to deal with, and so they're in the bathroom longer for that reason. If anyone needs help going to the bathroom, so whether it's a small child or whether it's someone older, usually it's women that go with them to assist them. And so to make the bathrooms half and half is actually not fair. And it's part of the reason why, and I think Nicole might agree with me, when you go to any public washroom, there is a line outside for women and men just walk in, right? And we kind of, we laugh at it and we're like, oh yeah, that's always the way it is, right? But it's always the way it is because women actually need bigger bathrooms, right? They need more space because, again, they tend to be in there more often, and they tend to take longer, and they tend to assist others as well. And so, again, having an equal split of men and women's washrooms is actually not fair. The equality is not fair, right? And so that's kind of what I'm trying to say here, is that we need, in building equality, we have to figure out what people need. And back when we were talking about ability and disability, some of those things were a little more easily tangible, right? If people can't see, or if people have to use a wheelchair to move around, you can pretty clearly see the structural changes you need to make in order to accommodate those people, right? But here it's kind of less obvious, right? It's less obvious that bathrooms that are equally split between men and women actually are not equal at all, right? And as a result, us men just get to walk in and out of the bathroom, usually without any wait time, and women are stuck in a lineup, right? Because again, the equality is not equal, right? The equality is not fair, which is tricky, right? So as a quick summary, I said that we were trying to look at sexism through popular media for the most part, right? So how do we transmit and sort of learn ideas of gender or sexual inequality from the media, right? And so that's in there. So we talked about this. I showed this to you yesterday, the idea that sex and gender are different, and sex and gender and sort of who people are attracted to are kind of different things, right? And I would suspect that cisgender straight people are in the majority, but there's lots of people who don't fit in there, right? And so we have to, we have to make space for that. We have to, create a safe environment for people to exist, right? Because again, none of us choose what sex we are, right? At least I don't think you can. I couldn't. None of us choose our gender. I didn't choose to be a man. I just am, right? None of us choose our sexual orientation, right? I am attracted to women. I'm happy with that, but I didn't choose that, right? And I don't think I could choose to be attracted to men if I wanted to. They're gross. No, they're not gross. But people don't choose these things, right? So I think it's important that we create safety so that people can be who they are. Because again, you don't get a choice, right? You don't get a choice in your sex, your gender, your sexual orientation, color of your skin. None of that is by choice, right? We said that, of course, all societies have gender roles, and they enforce those gender roles, right? They try to get people to follow them, and so people who don't fit into easy categories of man or woman or male or female, they often struggle quite a bit, right? Because again, society, at least in Western society, we traditionally have only had two genders, and when we see someone who doesn't fit in one of those very easily, people get confused, right? And they start to discriminate against them, right? I said that lots of these rules are culturally constructed. Men and women are biologically different, but a lot of the things that we think about men and women are, in fact, not biological. They're culturally constructed, right? We said that much of mainstream media, whether it's advertising or movies or television, will often show us stereotypes, right? Because, again, with ads or with television shows, the producers don't want to complicate the situation, right? They want you to focus on one thing, whether it's a product or whether it's a story, right? So with the laundry detergent, they want you to focus on that, right? In Mean Girls, they want you to focus on the relationship between Katie and Regina and maybe some of the other plastics. They don't want you to focus on Damien, right? So Damien is a very stereotypical gay guy character, the gay best friend, right? And he's, as I say, he's very flat, he's very stereotypical, but they don't want you to focus on him, right? They want you to focus on the main characters. But in the process, they kind of normalize what we think gay people are like, right? And so the more we see Damiens show up in the media, the more we think, oh, well, that's what all gay people are like, right? And that's not true, right? Some are, but some aren't. Yeah, so these ideas become normalized to us. We talked about misogyny a little bit, the sort of contempt or hatred or prejudice against women. And again, this is not too hard to find, right? There's lots of misogynistic tweets and Instagram posts floating around. I hope you don't follow anyone who posts those kind of things. But we can see them, in shows like The Big Bang Theory, which was hugely popular on television, right? But lots of misogyny, but those characters get away with it because they're framed as good guys, right? They're framed as harmless. They're framed as socially awkward nerds, right? Who could never do anything bad. But of course, in real life, we know that that's not always the case, right? If somebody gives you a teddy bear with a webcam in it, it doesn't matter who does it, right? It's a violation of your privacy, right? And again, that's kind of a made up, I don't think that would ever work. But even if it did work, if those images were to get out, they can really damage someone's life, right? And it doesn't matter how harmless the person thinks they are, they can still cause a lot of damage, right? And they can make women feel really unsafe, right? And so, again, it's okay to enjoy some of these things, but we should, be very critical of what we're seeing, right? Because again, there are lots of shows out there that don't have to do that, right? Like you don't have to you don't have to be misogynistic to get a laugh, right? And I think in the video essay we saw with the Big Bang Theory, the author mentioned a few different sort of nerdy characters who can be nerdy and weird and funny, but they don't have to be misogynistic in the process, right? You can do that, right? And so, good morning. And so, yeah, we should, right? We talked a little bit about music video and how often in pop music things, particularly women, are over-sexualized, right? There's lots of stuff that's leaking over from the world of porn and the world of stripping and things like that. And again, I think we should pay attention to that as well, because again, those messages are kind of mixed into the music. Music can be very it can be a very effective agent of socialization, right? You may only watch your favorite movie once or twice a year, but your favorite songs, you're going to listen to them all the time, right? And so the messages that are in the songs or the messages that are in the video are important, right? Particularly if that music is being marketed to young people, right? And so Ariana Grande, I would caution her, because yes, she has, women your age, in their late teens or early 20s that kind of get what's going on. But Ariana also has a lot of younger fans, right, who don't quite know or understand what they're seeing, right? They can't critique the kind of messages they're being given. Good morning. Yeah. We talked a little bit about where this inequality comes from between men and women. So we listened to a TED Talk by Christopher Ryan, and he told us that human sexuality is primarily a bonding device, right? It's not something that we use just to reproduce. But in the process of that, he said that, well, we kind of added to it, but there was this thing called patriarchy, right? That even though men and women had started out reasonably equal when they were hunter-gatherers, women had kind of lost that inequality, right? And we said that had to do with the advent of agriculture, right? And the desire of men to, know who their children are, know who their sons are, so they can pass on their land, right? And their wealth. What do they say? Women have babies and men have maybes, right? No, they don't say that? Somebody says that. I've heard it before. I didn't make it up. So in an attempt to make sure that a man's son is actually his, societies tightly control sexuality, right? Particularly of women, also of men, but particularly of women. And so you see, no sex before marriage, no sex outside of the marriage, and if people violate those rules, you see pretty strict and sometimes brutal punishments, right? Particularly for women. And that goes back to agriculture and property transfer, right? That's not naturally the way humans are, right? It's not biologically how we are, and it's not how we existed for hundreds of thousands of years. But that switch to farming kind of changed how human societies worked. Whoops. Yeah, so because men have been in a position of power for centuries and thousands of years, arguably, they have been able to create society in a way that benefits them, right? They've been able to enforce their prejudices on most societies and kind of create structures and institutions and social norms that benefit them and do not benefit women, right? And so women don't hold institutional power, and therefore it is difficult for them to create change, right? It's a lot of work. If you do have control of social institutions, much easier, right? You can use those institutions to your advantage. But women and other minoritized groups cannot, right? They just don't have that kind of power. Again, it's not about the numbers, right? It's not about majorities and minorities. It's about who has power. Yeah, so I think that is it. Does anyone want to say anything else about sexism or that before we leave it? The questions that you thought we would answer that we didn't? Uh, yes, I believe a little bit of it. We won't. It won't be it won't be all of sexism because there's too much. So it'll be about halfway. And I think I posted in Microsoft Teams this morning, and I put class 15 to 25, I think, something like that. So that doesn't cover all of sexism. It gets about halfway through, just to be managed, just to keep it manageable. Any other sexism questions, sex questions, relationship questions, sexual violence questions, questions about sexuality or gender or any of that stuff? It's an open floor. You can ask whatever you want. No? Going once? Going twice? Okay. All right. Well, that will bring us to racism. And so this is probably the type of oppression or inequality that we think of first, right? It's very it's very in the news right now, right? Lots of people are talking about it. There's the Black Lives Matter movement and police violence and George Floyd and everything going on in the United States. Here right now we're talking about Indigenous people and Indian residential schools because of the discovery of a number of unmarked graves at a BC Indian residential school, right? So this is very much in the news, right? But it's also a very difficult thing to talk about. And part of the reason I think it's difficult to talk about is because people have a lot of sensitivity towards it, right? It's certainly, racism is something that's certainly been very hurtful to a large number of people, right? People do get upset over things to do with racism, and sometimes rightly so. But I would also argue that a lot of people don't quite know what they're talking about sometimes when they talk about racism. And there's a really strong, this is almost becoming a social norm thing. There's a very strong pressure not to be seen as racist, right? Would you say that? Yeah. Like being called a racist now is like the worst thing you could possibly be, almost, right? It's very sensitive, right? It's a very sensitive issue. And so, that last piece is difficult because it makes it difficult to even talk about race, because nobody wants to be seen as saying the wrong thing, right? Or doing the wrong thing. So I hope in this class that we can kind of relax enough to sort of talk about it and not be too panicked. But we'll see how it goes. It'll go fine, but we'll see. Let me start off by asking you a couple of questions, okay? If I asked you, and I am asking you, what race is, what would you tell me? What's race? Color? Like of your skin? Okay, so humans come in a wide, no, not that wide, but a selection of colors, right? So that's part of it. What else? Or is that just it? Heritage? Okay, what do you mean heritage? Do people ask that? Do people say, "Hey, what's your race?" Okay. What's your background? Right. So you didn't look like every other Singaporean? No, they were mostly Chinese. Yeah. Yeah. What did you tell them when they asked? I just told them my dad's Italian, my mom's Indonesian. Okay. Did it bother you when people asked, kind of what you were? Not really. It just what bothered me was when I told them I'm half Italian, they would immediately ask, "Oh, is your dad in the mafia?" Oh. So the stereotypes came out, right?
Yeah.
People were like, oh, okay, yeah. Do you like to eat spaghetti? And you know,
Kind of annoyed me because I love spaghetti.
yeah. Well, who doesn't, right? But yeah. What are your thoughts on on pasta and organized crime, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What else? Or Rafay, did you want to add something before?
Yeah, when someone asks for your background, aren't they asking your ethnicity?
Well,
Your race?
that's a good question, right? And that's one of the things that will separate out, because I think people get those two things confused, right? In terms of race, in terms of ethnicity, and sometimes even in terms of religion, right? So sometimes prejudice against Muslim people is seen as racism, right? But Muslim is not a race, right? That's a religion. So it's a different thing. But sometimes they get kind of lumped into one thing. Um, what else would you tell me about race? What is it?
Aren't we all the same race?
Aren't we all?
Yeah, human race.
Well, it's true, right? People often say the human race, right? But I think we kind of instinctively know that that's not really the way many societies work, right? Yes, we're all humans, but sometimes we don't act as if we all are, right? If I asked you what race you were, or what race I was, would you be able? Would you have an answer for that? If I said, "Hey, what race are you?" Would you be able to say something about that?
Say Eurasian, I guess.
You'd say what?
That's what they call us.
What are you?
Asian or Eurasian.
Eurasian, okay. So you've got some European
Yeah.
and some Asian.
That's what's on my, in Singapore on our IDs.
Uh-huh.
They put our races on it.
Okay.
There's Chinese, Indian, Eurasian.
Ah.
Does race depend on the continent you come from?
Does it depend on the continent you come from?
Yeah, like Asian race.
I think is Asia really a race?
Well, that's
Asian people are a race, I guess.
Because the South Asian is not the
yeah, well,
scientific debate on Asia is not really a race.
often we talk about Asian as if it's a race, right? But Asia's a big place, right? There's literally millions, well, literally billions of people living in Asia. And again, they're not all the same, right? So, yeah, is Asian really a race? But
Country where you come from.
okay. So, am I Canadian?
Isn't that ethnicity?
Isn't that ethnicity, or is it nationality, right? Or are these things different or the same?
Asian.
Huh?
Caucasian.
Yeah, Caucasian is even though, well, yeah,
People
I
don't really use that term anymore.
no, I have no. Does anyone know where the Caucasus are?
What?
So the term Caucasian comes from the Caucasus region. Do you know where that is? No? It's on the moon. That's where we come from. No. It is kind of southwestern Russia currently is where it is now. But yeah, the idea that I'm not even sure. Well, we'll get to that. I think I know where that comes from. And actually, no, I might know where that.
Just what in Singapore, everyone called white people Caucasian.
Really?
Yeah, that's what, like on the ID card.
Yeah.
You're white, your race is Caucasian.
Okay. Yeah, and that's probably the official term for being white, right? Although lots of times we just say that white people are white people, right? Who gets to say what race you are? Immigration does? So they put in your passport, so you are officially.
I don't have a choice anymore.
Could you? Well, that's my question. Do you? Do you have a choice?
I don't think you do.
Do you think there's any possibility that someone could change their race? That they could be one race and then be another one?
The race is determined at birth, so I don't think you change it.
It's determined at birth in terms of like your genetics?
Yeah, it's already known even before you're born, so
I guess that's true, right? It's almost in a way it's similar to your sex assigned at birth, right? Your parents, your genetic code, none of that is your choosing, right? You just get what you get, and here you are, right? In a body that is, a certain, certain sex, looks a certain way, is a certain color. Yeah, we don't choose any of that, right? Um, Basil sort of points out here, I'm guessing humorously, Michael Jackson, who of course was black, but as far as I know, used a lot of skin bleaching treatments to lighten his skin, right? In addition to plastic surgery, and it became quite horrible, right?
No, especially looks like a ghost.
Yeah, he did not look. He did not look good. Which is too bad, because he's a very handsome. He was a very handsome man prior to all of that stuff. And man, what a talented guy! Holy cow! What's that? Amazing voice, amazing musical talent, phenomenal dancer. I remember when I was a kid, he was massive, right? Like because that was like the early '80s, like early to mid '80s, and he was just like the biggest thing, right? That was, yeah, that was too bad.
So can I ask you a question?
Well, yeah, always.
Life in the early 80s better than the life right now?
Well, it's hard to know because, like, I was a kid in the early '80s. The music was great. I have fond memories of that time, but it's tough, right? Because when you're a kid, you don't really, you're not really getting kind of a full
adult experience.
yeah, a full kind of adult experience of what it was like. I liked it. I liked the early '80s. I liked where we lived and where I went to school, and yeah, I was pretty happy. 1980 to 1986, if you will.
It's like the kids who are born now, they're gonna be like missing out on the childhood, right? Because of the internet.
They're gonna be
Missing out technology. Like most of the kids I've seen, they just stay on iPad.
Right. Yeah. What do you think about that?
I don't know.
I don't like it.
You don't like that?
There's less creativity there.
There's no socialization between people their ages. They don't hang
Oh.
out. It's something they're gonna miss out on.
Right.
My
See-
cousin, when she was 6, she already had an iPad. And I was like, what the hell? She, like, you know how we used to have coloring books?
Yeah.
Yeah, she had a coloring pad.
Yeah.
And all she had to do was like smack it, and then she'd rather go back home after school and play with her iPad
Yeah.
than play at the playground.
Yeah. I saw a woman who we worked with. She had I think her baby was 2 years old, and we went out to a restaurant, and she brought the little 2-year-old and brought the iPad to entertain her. And this kid was 2 and was using the iPad, and I swear was like just so close to being able to search for like Finding Nemo videos on YouTube.
Wow.
Like because she loved Finding Nemo, and so if you show her a little bit of the movie, she loved watching it. But so like, yeah, I don't know. Like I hear you, but I kind of wonder because there's always like that. There's always like that kind of nostalgia thing where people were, old people are like, oh, things were better in my day. Now all you kids with your newfangled technology, and like every generation does that, right? So I'm kind of concerned about that, but still, like, yeah, like I grew up in a world with no internet, right, and no cell phones and none of that stuff. So yeah, and we did go outside, right? We did play outdoors, right? And it's weird now, like when you're in neighborhoods and there's no kids outside, right? Everyone is that weird for you?
Very.
Yeah, like kids are never outside unless they're with their parents, right? And I was outside all the time. Like
I was playing football in the street.
yeah, I played hockey in the street. I came home for meals and to sleep, and that was it. But
My friends, we used to play hide and seek in childhood.
Yeah.
And that was so fun.
In the entire building, like.
Yeah, it's like there were 5 floors.
Okay.
So the guy, Jenner, like the guy who catches people,
Yeah.
he starts from the bottom,
Okay.
and people hide on other floors. Like they can't go in any other apartment, just like on the floor. And then he has to check every floor, each by each one by one.
Oh yeah. Are there actually places to hide?
Yeah.
Okay.
I used to big tag like that.
Yeah, it's yeah, like I'm careful not to just, say, oh yeah, things were better in my day, because that's how it always is. But yeah, I feel bad, like that the kids can't just go
It's like they're missing out.
outside. Yeah, and the world is safer now than it was,
Back then.
yeah, when I was a kid. And I did lots of stupid things, and I managed not to, lots of scrapes and cuts and a few stitches, but
You turned out
I turned out all right, right? I survived. So yeah, I hear that, like I don't want to just assume things were better, but yeah, I am kind of sad, and I like it when kids play outside, because they should be out running around. But, anyway, tangent. Is race meaningful? Does it mean something?
It's more about the culture.
It's more about, okay, how do you mean that?
Like different races have different cultures.
Okay.
The culture is the race itself, kind of practices, the festivals,
Okay.
the celebrations.
The things people believe, right? The way they see the world. Okay. Are there ways in which race is not meaningful?
I can't really think of anything.
No? I don't know. Or you can't think? Okay. This is good. This is a good place to start. This is kind of where I thought we were, and this'll be helpful. I think we kind of struggled to define race, because I think most people can't, right? Most people don't really, again, most people, will get upset about racism and will, have an opinion about it, but most people can't really talk about what race is, or even where it comes from. Where do you think race comes from? Why do you think humans care, that you're Eurasian, right? And you're black, and I'm white, and you're
Stereotypes?
Asian?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Brown.
Yeah, like, well, why do you think people started to care about that?
Stereotypes?
Yeah. Where did stereotypes come from, though? Okay, this is good. This is really good. All right. So, again, this is a very socially charged issue. Most people, I think, don't know what they're talking about. There's lots of institutional interest in upholding racism as well, right? And so, people in Canada and the U.S., it's white people. White people benefit from racism, right? And so they don't usually like to talk about it, and sometimes they feel threatened, right? Because they feel that they may lose the power that they already have. I won't go all through these, but it's a sensitive issue, but we'll be okay with it. Here's where we'll start. We'll untangle two things that we've already mentioned: race and ethnicity, right? So notice here, race is a social distinction, right? Note that I'm not saying it's a biological distinction, right? I'm saying it's a social distinction based on what we see, right? So physical characteristics. Color of our skin plays a big role in it, right? But also, the shape of our eyes, how our hair grows, maybe other types of facial features, right? Or structures that occur, in different populations. Those are some of the things that define race for people, right? But again, notice that I've said it's a social distinction, not a biological one, okay? Ethnicity, I think we were kind of right about that, right? It's rooted in your cultural differences, right? So people with a certain ethnicity have a certain culture, a certain language, sometimes kind of a certain history, right? A certain history of their people behind them. That's your ethnicity, right? Your nationality, of course, is just where you were born, right? So, Ben, where were you born? Italy? Yeah, so that so technically I guess your nationality would be Italian. Yeah, Sicilian. But again, you may, if you spent most of your life in Singapore, you might, even though you're born in Italy, you might define yourself differently, or maybe not. Yeah.
So frequent,
Yeah, exactly, right? So these things are different, right? One is a social category based on what we see, right? How people look to us. The other one is based in cultural differences, right? Cultural, linguistic, and historical differences. Now, we often think about race in biological terms, right? Because the only reason that all of our skin color is the way it is, or our hair, or our eyes, or whatever, those are genetic differences, right? Sorry, Nicole, I'm going to use you as an example. We are different colors, right? And we're different colors because of our genes, right? It's not that you spent so much time in the sun and I didn't, right?
Yeah.
It's not that. It's we have different genes, right, that code the melanin, the pigment in our skin, right? And so there is a biological difference, but how biologically different are we is the question, right? And so if you look at human DNA, and we can, right? Because we described the human genome, 20 years ago now. I think it cost $1 billion to do, shockingly. Now you can get your whole genome for like $300 from 23andMe. But 20 or 30 years ago, it took $1 billion to decode an entire human DNA sequence, right? Way easier now, very difficult in the past. So we have hundreds of thousands of genes, and each gene is made up of a bunch of different sequences, right? There's 4 different chemicals. What is it? Adenine, guanine, cytosine, and damn it, forgot. There's 4 different chemicals that encode those genes. There's billions of little protein strands that are organized in a certain way that make me, and you, right? And again, we have the technology to decode all of these, right, and read them. And what scientists have found by looking at the DNA strands, the human genomes of all kinds of different people and all kinds of different populations, what they found is that we're actually not that different as a human race, if you will. So, of course, there we are, right? Our genes are spread among 23 chromosomes, right? If you're a male, you have an X and a Y, and if you're a female, you have 2 X's. But again, the genetic evidence, the scientific evidence suggests that race is not a thing in humans, right? Human populations are not distinctive enough, okay? And so if you were talking biology, a race, when you get a race of animals, what you do is you have a big, I don't know, what do you have? Crows. We have lots of crows outside, right? Blackbirds. If you take a bunch of those crows and you isolate them on an island where they can't reach the main population of crows anymore, and you leave them there for, I don't know, a few thousand years, they will start to evolve, right? They'll start to change. Their gene frequencies will start to adapt, and they'll start to be a little bit different from the main population. And so eventually the kind of genes that they have in the population will change to the point where they're actually different from the main population. They're kind of on their way to becoming their own subspecies or their own species. They're not there yet, but they're on their way. But with humans, we've really never had that, right? Humans have always been nomadic, right? We've always moved around quite a bit. People from one part of the world have been interacting with people from other parts of the world for hundreds of thousands of years, right? And so we are, genetically speaking, there are no racial differences. We are basically the same, right? So, sorry, Nicole, I'm going to use you as an example again. So, to look at us people would recognize us as different races. Your skin is a different color than mine. Your hair grows differently than mine. Your hair actually grows, which is I'm jealous of. Mine's kind of, you know. Our eyes are a different color, right? And so people would recognize us as different, right? Let's say Sarah, for instance. Sarah is white, right? We've seen Sarah. So Sarah is white. Sarah's genes and my genes probably come from a similar area of the world, right? Hers kind of come mostly from Italy, I think. Mine come from kind of North Europe and Britain. But we're both kind of white people, right? And so you, of course, I'm going to guess that your ancestry is in Africa, which I kind of know. So our genes come from different places, right? But if we were to analyze Sarah's DNA sequence and my DNA sequence and your DNA sequence, we might actually find that I might be more genetically similar to you than to Sarah. Because what scientists have found is that there's actually more genetic variability within a race than between them. And so the things that make us visually different, right? The color of our skin, our hair, our eyes, maybe a couple of other features, those are just a handful of genes, right? And to humans who use their eyes to kind of understand the world, people might look at you and me and say, oh, that's a big difference, right? We're really different. But if you look at our genetic coding, you'll find that there's just a few genes that make that difference. And our eyes feel like, oh, this is a big difference that you're one color and I'm another color. But genetically speaking, you've just got a few genes that code for that, right? And of course, most people from Africa have picked up gene sequences that are darker, right? So, those changes aren't, or those differences are minor, right? When you're talking about hundreds of thousands of genes and billions of little base pairs of proteins, you know, a few proteins here and there doesn't make us really any different, right? The other thing is that most of the things that we see as racial differences are actually environmental adaptations, right? So, Nicole, your skin is dark, right? And so it is dark, of course, because your ancestors came from a very sunny, warm place. You need to protect yourself from the sun, right? And so it becomes adaptive, right? It becomes evolutionarily adaptive to have some sort of barrier between you and the sun, right? And of course, you'll see that not just in Africa, but in other places around the equator as well, right? People tend to have darker skin, right? Where my ancestors come from, like Northern Europe and Britain and Scandinavia, blocking yourself from the sun is not your problem, right? Because it's wet and cold and awful, right? And so what you need is skin that is see-through, right? Because you need to have sunlight entering your skin to help your body synthesize vitamin D, right? So your ancestors developed a system to protect themselves from the sun. My ancestors developed a way to actually let the sun in because there's no sun up there, right? And there's a bunch of these that are, you know, racial differences, but again, they're not really racial differences. They have to do with environment, and again, they're just not that big a difference, right? The problem is that because humans use their eyesight to understand the world to such a degree, we feel like it's a big deal, right? When we see someone who's a different color, right, or has different hair, we think, oh wow, that's big difference, right? But genetically speaking, not so, right? We have, in terms of genetic variability, we're basically all the same person. There has been more, I think it says this in the article I'm going to have you read, there's been more genetic variability found in a single group of chimpanzees than is found in the entire human race, believe it or not. So again, these kind of racial differences are not significant, right? We socially divide people up by the color of their skin or their hair or their eyes, but in terms of our biology, those differences are pretty much meaningless, right? We're so genetically similar actually it's kind of scary because, you know, things like a coronavirus can actually do a lot of damage because we don't have a lot of genetic protection. There aren't people with kind of built-in immunities and sort of different, different genetic susceptibility because we're all so similar, right? This coronavirus seems to have appeared in China, but it's affected everyone equally, right? And of course, how severe the disease has been is not it's not really up to genetics or races or anything. It's really up to how well governments have dealt with it, right? But people in Rwanda and people in Canada are equally susceptible to coronavirus, right? And again, government and infrastructure may have an effect, but again, we are the same, right? Basically, we're genetically the same. But yeah, so yeah, we share 99.9% of our genetic code with each other, right? And that's just that's just people in general, right? Never mind. So yeah, it's not a thing, right? In terms of biology, race is not a thing. But I'll give you a break here and we'll talk about it when we get back. But of course, it is socially important, right? We said that humans are interesting because they socially construct their reality, right? They create a bunch of things, and once everybody believes in it, it becomes real, right? And so if you believe that race is a important distinction between human beings, that can have a big effect on society, right? And it does have a big effect on society. Is it a meaningful difference between humans? No, it's ridiculous, right? There is literally no biological difference between any of us. But if everyone believes that there is, it has pretty significant effects, right? And we can, we don't have to think too hard to think of examples where that's true, right? Okay, let's take a little break, and then when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about this sort of race and biology and society and all that stuff, okay? So, 10-minute break. So, and we're back. So, yeah, to talk about human beings as biological races is ridiculous. I was going to say unfortunately, but it's not unfortunate. Yeah, it's ridiculous, right? Genetically speaking, there's just not that many differences between us. And the differences that we do have between us are pretty minor, right? And so even though our eyes might want to convince us that, oh, this person is quite different from me because of their skin color or the way their face looks or their eyes or their hair, whatever it is, rest assured, there are very few genes responsible for that sort of thing. And most of the way that human beings work is pretty identical, right? But again, we know that even though something's not biologically real, it can be socially significant, right? Humans socially construct their reality, and so anything that a bunch of humans believe has power, right? People will kill millions of other people for beliefs, right? And so things that are believed to be real have power. And so people believe race to be real, and of course it has power because of that. When we're talking about race here in kind of social justice terms, we'll talk about usually what we're talking about is white people in the dominant group, and then people of color in the minoritized group. And so people of color, or sometimes you see, I don't have it in my slide here, sometimes you see the acronym BIPOC, so BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, People of Color. None of these terms are really that great because they kind of take a bunch of people and they lump them into one category, right? And so, to be black in the United States is different from being, black in an African country, right? For people who have lived in the U.S. for generations, let's say black people who have lived in the U.S. for generations, and maybe a black person who's just immigrated to the United States, that's a different experience, right? To be black or indigenous in either of these countries is a different experience, right? To be I'm going to say Asian, even though we agreed that wasn't a race, but to be Asian in either of those countries is yet another different experience, right? And yet we're going to lump everybody into one category. So again, it kind of describes the dynamic that white people are generally in power and non-white people are not. But people of color or BIPOC or whatever you want to use, they're not really great terms because they take a bunch of different people with really different experiences and kind of put them in the same category. But we'll use it anyway. It's just not, it's not a very descriptive term, right? It kind of just lumps a bunch of people together. So I have a little article for you to read here, and it's a very interesting one because it's going to talk about some of the things that we've just talked about here, and it'll answer some of the questions that we also kind of posed earlier, like where does racism come from, right? And why do people pay attention to this kind of thing? Okay, so I have some questions for you here, and you can see, why does race as a category of people emerge? What were people thinking? What was the ideology of race? A little bit of science, and then we'll hear about some different types of racism, right? Relational racism, structural racism. It'll talk a little bit about Indigenous or Aboriginal people in Canada, and then it'll talk a little bit about colorblindness. So the article that you'll read here, just so you're aware, it's coming from, the perspective it's coming from is kind of an Indigenous Canadian perspective. So they'll be talking about racism kind of from that perspective, okay? But again, to some degree, racism is racism, and you can apply it to other groups. But what I'll do is I'll give you some time to read here. It is in Microsoft Teams, and it's called, do you see it there? Ben, you found it already? Okay. Okay. Yeah, it's called Understanding, it says Understanding Racism. So, you see it? Okay. So I'll give you some, let me just see here. Just want to remind myself what's in it. It's a little on the long side. Let's see. Why don't I give you about 12 minutes, and then we'll talk about what we've read so far. 12 minutes won't be enough to read the whole thing, I don't think, but that'll give us a start on it anyway. Okay? Oops. There we go. Malika, we're reading this article, which is in Microsoft Teams. It's yeah, yeah. Okay, so I know you're probably not finished this. That's okay. It's a bit this article is a little bit dense in some places, but that's okay too. Um, we'll still be able to pull what we need out of it. Um, but let's start with this one. So, when and why does race emerge as a social category?
It emerged as a social category when the Europeans colonized other countries
Yeah.
in 1604, I guess.
Yeah, so it happens. So people start talking about race at the same time as European countries start to colonize other parts of the world, right? And so we know that, once, well, that's not true, but we know that as countries start to sort of industrialize, Western countries start to industrialize, they start to sail around the world and take over other places, right? And so India, of course, becomes colonized, parts of Southeast Asia, most of Africa, North America, South America, right? Australia, all of these places are colonized by Western powers. And again, it's very interesting that racial categories start to appear at the same time, right? So why do these categories emerge then? What's the purpose of dividing people up?
To show the superiority of the European race.
That's true. That's part of it for sure. Yeah. Why else? Why else did these categories emerge? That's a piece, but I want a little bit more.
Scientists start to go deeper into it and identify the differences between them, so it makes it more
Yeah, yeah, yes. So science started to back up some of these ideas about racial difference. I'll show you some of this science in a little minute, in a minute. But why else were these designations kind of created?
What the difference in color, language, culture?
Right. So we did have people from Western Europe kind of sailing around the globe and probably encountering people that looked different from them and lived very different lives from the kinds of lives they were living as well, right? So there was probably a little bit of trying to sort of describe what they were seeing, right? Like what does it mean when you sail off around the world and you bump into some land, you get out and you see people who are, a different color from you, dressed completely differently, living a totally different lifestyle. How do you understand that, right? How do you understand those people? It's probably part of it, yeah. What else? Why else were these categories created?
Categorize people.
To what?
Categorize people.
Yes, but why categorize them? Why kind of work so hard to prove that people are different? If I go over to your house, okay? I go over to your house, I move into your house, I make all your stuff my stuff, and I make you live in the basement. That would be a pretty awful thing to do, right? Yeah, that's awful. Now, that would make me a pretty awful person, wouldn't it? So, how can I sort of explain this to myself, right? How can I come into your house, make all your stuff my stuff, make you live in the basement with maybe just a few simple things, and how can I feel good about that? Right? Or at least how can I not feel bad about myself for doing that?
I mean, the person, but the people who are living in the house, they're not good.
Yeah. Yeah, in some ways I kind of dehumanize the people in the house, right? So I think, well, it's my right to take your house because you're inferior, right? Or clearly you don't know how to live in a house, right? look at what you're doing to this house, right? It's not clean enough, or you haven't decorated it correctly, or you haven't arranged your house correctly, right? Clearly you shouldn't be given a house, so you live in the basement. I will take care of the house up here, and then maybe, once you learn how to take care of a house, you can come upstairs and live here too, maybe. Although in real life, you're never going to be able to do that, right? So I'm not sure if that's a great analogy or not, but it's a justification, right? If you're going to sort of go to someone else's country and enslave people and take their stuff, why are you doing this horrible thing, right? And again, all kinds of different social institutions kind of jump into action figuring out why that's okay, right? Well, science says, well, of course it's okay because, non-white cultures are inferior, right? They're not as smart, they're not as hardworking, they don't know how to, properly care for the land, they don't know how to use resources, right? Their religion says that these people are inferior. There was an idea of the white man's burden. Have you ever heard of that? The white man's burden. This was the idea that, of course, white people had become civilized, right? And so now their burden, their kind of like, job was to go around and like civilize everyone else so that everyone else could be as good as them.
Did they give themselves that name?
I don't know where the term came from, but it was, like civilization was viewed as the white man's burden. And so the white people had kind of like the chore of going around and civilizing people, right? So that they could be better, right? Even though, of course, nobody asked them to do this, and whether they were better or not is highly debatable, but that's how they felt, right? And so, this category of race doesn't really exist until white Europeans start to sail around the world and take over other places. And again, they need a reason to treat these people awful, right? And the reason is, they're different, right? They are not as smart, not as hardworking, not as sophisticated, they're uncivilized, and, they can't be allowed to sort of, live in their house because clearly they don't know how to run a house, right? Which is ridiculous, but...
Stereotype that people say about white people.
What's that?
Stereotype is that white people love making other people's problems their own problem.
Well, the white man's burden falls into that category, right? So interesting, right? Let me just see if I can show you some of this. Okay, here's some of this science, quote unquote. This is the last thing I'll show you today. Here's some of this science. So they mention this guy in the article here, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, right? So Blumenbach is kind of an early biologist working on trying to categorize humans, right? There's lots of biological research going on in the 16 and 1700s. There's Carl Linnaeus, who comes up with the way of naming species, right? So Homo sapiens, the sort of the two-name Latin version of our species. Carl Linnaeus comes up with that in, I think, 1774 or something like that. And so there's lots of biological stuff going on, and Blumenbach is one of these biologists who are trying to describe humans. And so he measures 60 human skulls, okay? 60 human skulls. And from those measurements, he decides that he can see a pattern, right? So based on the measurements of the skull, you can actually tell what race a human being belongs to. And he kind of creates these 5 categories, right? So there's the Caucasians on one side, the Mongolians there, the Malayans, the Ethiopians, and the Americans, right? And so we've kind of got different names here, but we've kind of got white people, we've got Asian people, we've got Southeast Asian people, we've got black people, and we've got North American, Indian, or indigenous people, right? Those are the categories he comes up with. To some degree, you can do this. Okay, so this is the real science. To some degree, you can measure skulls, and you can maybe make some guesses about, where this person's genes come from, but it's pretty tricky, right? It doesn't quite work the way you think it does. So you can't measure someone's skull and tell what race they are, because race is not a biological thing, right? So it doesn't work. The other thing is that you cannot describe all humans by 60 skulls, right? We talked about this in terms of our sample size. What is there now? 7 billion humans, and you're going to characterize them by 60 skulls? Ridiculous, right? Ridiculous. But again, this guy and other guys were trying to do this. They were trying to lay out races in humans. Again, they didn't really, they couldn't really read the genes of humans, but there's no such thing, right? You can't really do this, right? Interestingly, Blumenbach had some other ideas that were kind of coloring his analysis. And so, yeah, he had this idea that human races were based on this degenerative idea. And so the first people to be created in the Bible, Adam and Eve, he thought they were white people. And the reason we have other races is that they had somehow degenerated from white people. They had spent too much time in the sun, or they hadn't taken care of their health, and so now they were, they had degraded from white people. But if they took care of themselves, they could eventually transform back into the ideal person, the white person, right? Does this sound bonkers to you? It's crazy, right? It's crazy stuff. But again, he and other scientists believed this, right? And so that kind of colored his analysis, that was not a pun, colored his analysis. And again, it colored other scientists as well. Another thing that was going on a little bit later is craniometry. And so the idea that you could measure someone's skull, and that you could look at, if you could look at the inside of someone's skull and the sort of shape of their brain, you could tell what they were like. And so craniometry, or not craniometry, but phrenology started to appear a little bit later. And so you'll see this. Have you ever seen one of these? Sometimes people decorate their homes or offices with these kind of things. You've seen them before? Yeah, this is phrenology. And so the idea that if you look at particular parts of the brain and how they're shaped, you can tell what people are like, right? So, yeah, so here you can see, number 12, you can tell how cautious a person is. 13, you can tell how benevolent they are. Let's see, 22, individuality. Let's see, language, you can tell their language from 33. This is all bonkers, right? You cannot describe, the personality of someone and what they're like from the inside of their brain case. Ridiculous, right? But, phrenologists and craniometrists, or craniometrists, I don't know, they thought they could see these differences, right? And they thought that they could describe the, different races by craniometry and phrenology, right? And of course, who do you think always was, the hardest working and the most conscientious and the most moral? It's always white people, right? And so again, there's no truth to this. This is all BS, right? It's pseudoscience. If you try to bring this up in a real science class, they'll laugh at you, and they should, because it's crazy stuff, right? But again, it was the social institutions of the time kind of protecting the power of the dominant group. And so, again, science was able to, they thought, demonstrate differences between races, right? But again, there isn't any, right? It appears as a justification for why some people have power and why others don't, right? Or why it's okay for one group of people to go and, take everyone else's stuff and enslave the people of this country. Why is that okay? Well, they're just less than us, right? They're not as good, right? Maybe if they work hard, they can become as good as us, but until then, this is how it is, right? Okay. Can we leave it there? Do you have any questions at the moment that have come up so far? Was this new and interesting for you? Was there some interesting information? I hope. Okay. All right. So today is Wednesday. Tomorrow is a holiday. It is Canada Day. So happy Canada Day to you all. And we'll see you on Friday. Remember, Friday we have quizzes. I've put them in Microsoft Teams. I think I'm a little bit behind in my uploads, so I've got to upload some lecture slides, but I'll do that today. And I'll see you on Friday, okay? All right. Say again? Should you come at 9? Yes, you should. Yes, you should. Okay. That's all, people. See you. No class tomorrow because it's Canada Day. See you Friday for quizzes.